Hello and welcome to the Museum of American Speed. We're here in Lincoln, Nebraska. My name's Tim Matthews. I'm the curator here at the museum, and I'm honored to be with one of my bosses, Carson Smith, and we're going to walk through the museum and give you a little bit of a highlight tour. This place is huge. It's 150,000 square feet. It's 3 stories tall. We're actually building on, adding another 90,000 square feet. So, there's way too much to see today, but we'll tell you a little bit about the museum, kind of how it got started, and then we'll walk through, catch some of the highlights, and Carson will be with me to give you the real history and detail on some of this stuff, and I just know you're going to enjoy it. So Carson, tell the crowd a little bit about the passion that really fueled the museum. It started with Bill and Joyce, but really you and your younger brothers have continued that tradition.
Yeah, it's we're all really proud of the museum and the team that we built with Tim and everyone. We've had a lot of different team members come through as part of not only employees but docents. We have a large group of docents who volunteer time. The passion isn't just for our family; it goes much broader than that.
Well, and we're so lucky. Our volunteer team is about 55 strong. We have about 14 employees that make the museum what it is, and everybody has to chip in, and we're just so fortunate to have all that passion that's going to fuel what you're about to see as we walk through the museum. Yeah, as we enter the museum here, this is our open wheel room, and this is a room that celebrates really the heart of what Speedway Motors is and what it was, and how we really got our start with dirt track racing and early Indy racing, and what you see in this room kind of covers that full gamut of open wheel racing in America.
Yeah, and this display right here talks a little bit about why we have the cars, because this by itself isn't too meaningful, but when you see the car with the engine, the same engine in it, and understand what that is with Maury Rose, it's a big deal.
Absolutely. One of the cars we're walking by, the 1935 Miller Ford, is a spectacular car. You'll see it has a flathead Ford engine, and it was a front-wheel drive car. 3 people had to come together to make that car happen. Harry Miller, who we'll learn more about in just a second in the Miller room, but also Preston Tucker, famous for the Tucker torpedo automobile, and then also Edsel Ford, who was Henry Ford's son. They got together and wanted to design a car to win the Indy 500 in 1935, and this is the car, just one of 8 cars that were created originally. All cars, when they showed up at the track, they were like spaceships compared to everything else that was there. They were far ahead of their time, completely different design than what was at the track during that time period. And sadly, they built the car in such a short time period because they were under such stringent time constraints from Ford that they accidentally put the steering box too close to the exhaust. All the steering boxes seized up during the race, and none of the cars ended up finishing, which made Henry Ford very angry. And the rest of the story is kind of sad, how the cars got tucked away and Ford bought them back, and eventually some trickled out into the mainstream world, and we're just so lucky to have one of those cars. We'll walk into our Miller room. This is a really fun room to see. One of the things that people say about Miller engines is they have this kind of cosmic look to them. You know, they have a beautiful design, but they were really successful racing engines. You know, you're talking 1920s, 1930s dominating the Indy scene. And Carson, you might be able to talk a little bit about Bill's infatuation and interest in Harry Miller, because he was really a great guy.
Well, the Miller story is basically 3 guys. It's Harry Miller, Fred Offenhauser, and Leo Guzin. And if you look at their pictures, you can tell what they're good at. So he's a good salesman, right? He's good at selling. He's good in the machine shop. He's a great machinist. And Leo Guzin, he's a great engineer. This is Leo Guzin's design table. So seeing him sitting at the table designing the Offenhauser engines, that's where he sat. That's his chair. The only thing we're missing is the light in the windows right now.
It's like having Leonardo da Vinci's notebook for us. I mean, so yeah, that's, you walk in this room late at night, you get kind of this euphoric feeling just
That's
being
right.
in the same room. But if you look at these engines, you can see why they were successful. You know, they were designed to breathe and terrorize the racetracks, but yet they were very beautiful. You know, Harry Miller, like you say, Carson, was an amazing salesperson, but he really knew what people wanted, and he was looking to European designs to create what became the dominant American racing engine. And they were racing Offenhausers until what year? What was the last year an Offie was on the track?
1980.
Yeah.
When you come to the museum, you're going to have to come in here and take a little bit of time and read the timeline of racing that's around the walls. It's actually really fascinating. Millers started to be dominant in the late 20s, early 30s, and the last time they raced at Indy, in the Offenhauser version, it's basically the same design, it was 1980. So 60 years to be at the top of the heap, that is an unbelievable achievement. This is an engine that was built based on Studebaker to run the Indy 500. Mm-hmm. So it's an overhead valve conversion. And I think this is a 1953 Studebaker, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right, in 52, 53, that's correct.
So when you look at the block really close, it has a lot of the same basic dimensions of a small block Chevy. You know, everybody thinks the small block Chevy was extraordinarily revolutionary. When you look at one of these and you say, well, those guys, they had a pretty good design to start with.
Well, we'll kind of make a quick pass through some of the open wheel items and show you a few other things. I'm going to walk by the Black Deuce. This car is worthy of another 30 minutes of conversation, but I'm going to take you over to the A.J. Watson display. This display was created when A.J. Watson from Indianapolis, his family came to us, his two daughters, and mentioned that they had all of the contents of his garage where all of his fabulous Indy cars were built, and we were just so honored that they would want us to preserve something that belonged to A.J. So I went out to Indy and I saw his place, kind of his man cave, and saw all of his pictures stapled to the wall of all of his favorite cars that he had been involved with over the years. And I just fell in love. You know, I loved seeing garage scenes, and so we made a deal to bring that entire space here to the museum. And I brought my team out and we handled it like an archaeological dig. So we labeled everything, photographed everything. I think we took over 2,000 photographs of how he left everything when he had passed on. And we brought it all back, bagged it all, just like an FBI scene, and we brought it here and we recreated it just the way he'd left it, right down to the bolts in the bolt bin.
Well, and once you got the shop cleaned out, you took a picture of the floor. That's a plywood floor with a printed picture of what his shop floor looks like. So his shop floor actually looked just like that.
We really wanted it to be authentic, and I was just so proud of my team. As a matter of fact, when they were doing the drywall for this display, I came in and they'd painted it yellow. I thought, okay, well, that's to age it, but some of the nails were bent over, and I thought, golly, to my new guy, Dylan, does he not know how to pound nails in? So I asked him, I said, Dylan, what's up with the crooked nails? And he said, no, Tim, those were the crooked nails on A.J. Watson's wall. So that's the amount of detail that the team was able to get down to. And then when we had created the shop scene, we were looking for the right car, and obviously an A.J. Watson Roadster, the car that he was famous for building, that won Indy so many times. We really wanted to get a hold of one, and my friend Jason Van Sickle at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum called me and he said, Tim, I'm so happy what you're doing with the A.J. Watson shop. We'd like to send you the Race of Two Worlds winner from 1958, the Jim Rathman car, and you can have it on loan for a while. So I was just so tickled. I actually ran over to Carson and Clay's office to explain the phone call and how happy we were to have this car. Not only because it's a really cool car, it went over and beat all the Ferraris and Maseratis over in Europe, but it did so with one of our old friends, Bob McKee, a guy that had worked for Bill Smith way back in the day on his NASCAR endeavor. So that was a lot of fun, and to have Jim come and see it, have A.J. Watson's daughters come and see it and have an emotional response to the display, we knew we did our job right. So that was a lot of fun. We'll keep walking here. A couple other cool cars. We have a car over here we like to call the Pup. It's the first car to run seat belts at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. We could tell you a whole long story about why it has seat belts, but I'm going to make you take the tour to find that out. It's a fun story.
So you guys have probably seen this car on TV more than any race car ever. For decades, every time they ran the Daytona 500, the finish of this race with David Pearson and Richard Petty was run. And it's usually about a minute and a half clip that shows the last lap and a half or so. And they crashed at the end of the race. David Pearson kept it was bent up bad. David kept the engine running, and in Petty's car, the engine died. And they were literally a few hundred feet from the start-finish line. So David drove through the infield with his car all messed up. So he ended up winning. And Richard Petty, his car died. His crew came out, and they pushed the car across the finish line, which is actually illegal. So they penalized him a lap. But those two guys were, I think, 3 laps ahead of third place. So he still ran second. So
great finish. 1976 was the year, and they think just because David had the foresight to push the clutch in right before the crash, he kept the car running, which was an awesome finish.
It runs, we got it running, and the kids absolutely loved it because it absolutely thunders. It's about as loud as a dragster.
Yeah, I mean, if we fired it up, all those plaques would be crooked. We'd have to straighten them up again. It's that kind of car. We just love it. So, and we try to keep cars operable that come here to the museum. You'll see our collection is over 300 cars, a lot of cars that we circulate in and out to keep things fresh. But when a car comes to us running and driving, we really try to keep it that way. We found that that's the best way to preserve it. Other cars are for display purposes, and if they are, I call them pickled for a while. We do try to take all of the fluids out. We spend a lot of time being careful to make sure that they're preserved for the long haul. So now that we've talked about David Pearson, I want to take you over to the Indy pit and show you some more cool stuff. This is a great spot down here. This is an area we call our Indy pit. And down here, we really just celebrate the Indy 500 and everything that it is. The garages that you see behind me are recreations of the different eras of garages at Indy. The doors on the oldest series of garages are actual doors from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. All of the engines down here obviously are authentic, and they really cover a wide swath of time, everything from the early teens all the way to modern engines. And some of our latest engines here are from the 2000s. The
history, you can see the evolution of the history of the engines that raced at the Speedway.
Yeah.
Starting mostly with 4 cylinders and progressing to V8s.
It's amazing how history repeats itself.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the more modern engines in production cars, like the Quad 4 engine, for example, is just like a miniature Offenhauser, which is really fun to see. We also have a wide variety of cars down here, all of which have some great history that I won't get into on this trip. You'll have to come and learn more about them. The Cornelian, one of the first Chevrolet brothers entries into the Indy 500 with the first monocoque body. And then, of course, behind me I have the Mallard, which is also a famous car. So there's a lot to see for sure. But what I really want to do, Carson, is get up these stairs and go talk about some Speedway stuff.
Sure.
What do you say?
Could I tell one story about Offie?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Bobby Enser told me, because he raced the turbocharged Offies, and he told me that the turbo Offie at Indy was an extreme handful because it went from basically idle to 1,000 horsepower, and there was nothing in between. So it took that kind of special to run one of those turbo Offies.
That's for sure. Gives the tires a lot to contend with. That's for sure.
Right.
Well, typically, Carson, this is one of my favorite parts of the tour, and I can really get into the weeds on Speedway history, but it wouldn't be right for me to talk about this. You've lived this history, so I'd like you to talk about these cars. You were there.
This car here is a car we built for Pikes Peak and worked with General Motors and ran in '98. We only ran it once. We had trouble getting the aero matched right, and part of it was they changed the rules on us for the unlimited class. We had to run a full-bodied car, and there was all sorts of issues. These are the cars that my dad had raced through the 60s and 70s, And I think my dad basically retired from sprint car racing in like 78 or 79. The sedan, he had Lloyd Beckman drive, and Lloyd was an amazing driver. He was gruff and tough, and I mean, he matched an old sailor.
You didn't make him mad in the pits,
Yeah,
that's for sure.
And he had hands that were, he was a boxer, and he had hands that were fast as lightning. And one of the stories about Lloyd is he'd go like this. Tim would ask me, "What'd you do that for?" He said, "I just caught a fly." And
Yeah.
Tim would say, "Oh, you didn't." He said, "You want to bet?" Lloyd had let his hand out, and the fly would go flying off.
That's
And,
a great story. I've not heard that one. That's fun.
That car there was the Mechanical Rabbit, and there were 3 of them built. And Don Brown built him. He was from Indiana. I don't think he was in Indianapolis. I think he was one of the suburbs around Indianapolis. And he built those cars, and they were really successful. And Tim, you probably know the story better about that car than I do.
Yeah, little Joe Saldana drove it, and 1963 was the time. And what I really love about these 3 cars being next to each other is you see the amount of innovation that happened during one decade. So you're looking at a car from 1959 and a car from late 60s. And so, how much things were changing. Every time you brought your car to the track, the next weekend it was almost obsolete. So you're really trying to stay ahead of the curve, which a lot of modern day racers obviously do today. But yeah, that car was called the Mechanical Rabbit. The reason is because, if you'd ever go to the Greyhound dog races, the Mechanical Rabbit always won the race. That was always the first one across the finish line. I love looking at old pictures and kind of reminiscing about what could have been and how much we've grown and changed. Or we're always sharpening the pencil, always trying to push to the next level. So that's what makes it so much fun. This is a room we call Bill's Garage, because back in the day when Bill was alive, we would keep running driving cars in here that Bill could take out when he wanted to. And it really became kind of a gallery for rotating exhibits. And right now we have a little bit of everything in here. The main thing that we're celebrating in this room is race team from Herzog Motorsports, which is right down in St. Joseph, Missouri. And Herzog Motorsports was really involved in all types of racing. They got their start in dirt track, like Baja racing, off-road, and then they eventually, they brought up a guy that some of you may know named Jimmy Johnson, who got his start with stadium trucks and off-road racing, but then decided he wanted to give NASCAR a try. So of course they got into NASCAR racing later, and then eventually drag racing. But this room really celebrates them. But we also have some other vehicles in here that are new to the collection. So a lot of times when new things come, they start out here before they get assimilated into different galleries. So as we walk around, you'll see some of those cars. A great one is the Hetty Lamar Cadillac in the corner that we'll look at in a second. Hetty was a fantastic person who was not only a Hollywood movie star, but she was also a brilliant scientist. And she developed the technology that's in everybody's cell phone, that she originally designed with the help of another man to stop guided torpedoes during World War II, called frequency hopping, I think is what they called it. But fabulous story. Yeah. Carson, there's one vehicle in here we have to talk about, and that's the chassis over here. This is kind of a fun one. This particular chassis is really cool because it came to us through the Herzog collection. And when we asked Herzog, what they were doing with it, they said, well, we used it for racing Pikes Peak. And we got the vehicle here, and we decided to take the body off of it so we could show people the technology underneath, because the chassis is really fascinating. And then when Carson saw it, it was kind of like a long forgotten family member showed up, because Carson, you actually did a lot of this design work on this chassis.
Yeah, the story about the night the Herzogs were here, they had this chassis. The elevator over here is an elevator to go between the 2 floors, and this chassis wasn't ready to display, and they didn't think that the night of the Herzogs they wanted to have it out, so it was actually sitting in the elevator. And I heard they had a chassis, and the guys went over and opened the elevator up, and then I saw it, and I said, well, that's my truck. and this is the truck that we built for GM. It was an S10. This is the S10 pickup, and you can see how far the driver is over to the left side, so that the air will run through. We didn't have all of these tubes. Some of these tubes were added, we didn't have all these tubes in here. I think we had these two, but this one wasn't here to let the air flow through. And the bottom of the truck is down low, and there's Zutz fasteners right here. That's to hold the shape of that airfoil that was in the box of the truck. It was a fun truck. Needless to say, the next year they outlawed that.
Imagine that.
But it was fast. So
it was just great to see Carson's face when he saw his car come back. And speaking of things that are getting delivered, this little car just showed up literally an hour ago when we started filming, so we still need to get it into its permanent location. But this is the world's fastest gravity-powered car. It went 101.96 miles an hour, and the builders and racers of this car called me up and said, hey, how would you guys like the world's fastest gravity car? And of course we were ecstatic to have it. And for any of you listening out there, we're always willing to talk about donations and to tell your story. I mean, if you've done something in the world of motorsports or speed, we're always here on the phone ready to talk to you. This room we just walked into is our land speed gallery, and you'll see all kinds of cars in here. We've got cars that have gone 600 miles an hour. A lot of cars here have been into the 300 mile an hour zone. We have the first street driven 200 mile an hour car here that went a little bit over 200 miles an hour in 1963, and then he drove it back home. It is a lot of great stuff. Some of the names in this room would be Art Arfon, Seth Hammond. We have a car from John McKeegan, who is our previous curator here, who built a car that went 325 miles an hour, basically in his barn, and it's built like a hot rod. It's got a small block Chevy, it's got a quick change rear end and a rock crusher transmission. Of course, they're all super tuned to go 300 miles an hour, but built like a real hot rodder. So that's a lot of fun. You can spend a lot of time in this gallery. The Green Monster, which is this red, white, and blue car in front of me, this car has gone 650 miles per hour. It has an engine out of an F4 Phantom jet. The guy who built it, raced it out at Bonneville, and he was kind of somebody that was really kind of a grassroots guy. He'd buy things that he could afford and didn't have a big budget, but had to have been crazy to drive a car like that 600 miles an hour.
I don't think the Phantom could go much faster than that.
I was going to say
without going into a dive,
this thing
have gravity help them.
Yeah, this thing wanted to fly. It's in fact so heavy that if we roll it on the granite tiles, it'll crack them. We have to lay plywood down just to roll it and move it into place. It weighs a metric ton. It was donated to us from the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles, so we were just so tickled to get it.
Back in the 60s, there were auto shows all over the country. Usually they were done at the Civic Auditorium kind of events where all of the car enthusiasts of the area would bring their cars in to be on display and judged. They were usually in the fall, winter time, and these cars were basically the draw they'd use to promote, to get people to come to the car show because they wanted to see something new and special. A lot of these cars here were actually made into kits, model kits. As a kid, you might have put some of these together from the was it Revel?
Yep, Revel, AMT, Monogram, all those companies.
Yep.
Back in the day when every kid wanted to be a gearhead and they wanted to build the cars they saw.
It was a way to get started.
Absolutely.
Putting the car together.
Daryl Starbird, considered the king of the bubble top. He was right down in Oklahoma, but getting national attention for the cars he was building. Get this car is built out of a 1957 T-Bird in 1958. It was a brand new car. The car behind it is a 1964 Corvette that when it had 2,400 miles on it, kid got it for graduation, and he brought it to Daryl Starbird's shop in Oklahoma and said, I want the most bitchin' custom you can build me. And so he started chopping on a mid-year Corvette with 2,000 miles. I can't even imagine. And he built this double bubble thing that ended up being on Mission Impossible and a lot of TV shows. It was at the Barris Custom Shop for a while. So these cars all have cool stories, and you get going, and you could go on forever. We're standing right in front of my favorite car in the museum, the Tucker Torpedo. And Carson, you know a lot about the history, how your dad got this car, because not a lot of people have these.
No, I actually don't know all of the story about how he got it, but the Tuckers was an interesting car. As an engineer, I understand that every few cars, they'd actually change the design. And this one here runs, and it was actually used in the movie, but it has, the suspension is really unique because the upper and lower A-arms, it has a big block of rubber in between the A-arms, and that's what holds them in place. So that to move the A-arms up and down, it flexed that blocks of rubber. It wasn't a very good design, didn't work very well because rubber doesn't like to do that a lot for a long time. It'll do it for a while, but it had an interesting suspension. And as I've understood, Tucker did this on his cars, so that if you have a Tucker, it may be one of one.
Mm-hmm, that's true. There were only 51 cars built, 48 still exist. This one is Waltz Blue, which was Preston Tucker's wife's favorite color. It matched the color of one of her evening gowns. And we just had the grandson of Preston Tucker here at the museum just 3 days ago. And it was cool because he looked at our display and he said, "You guys are the only place that has one of the prototype 589 cubic inch opposed engines on display," which is right behind the car. So if you get a chance to come, you'll see it. You know, as I mentioned earlier with the Ford race car that we talked about, very first car in the front door, Preston Tucker and Miller were friends. And Preston asked Harry Miller, you know, "I'm going to build this production car. What should I do?" And he said, "If you go big or go home. Do as many cubic inches as you can." So he created this engine with pistons the size of paint cans. But the problem was it had hydraulically actuated valves, and they had a heck of a time getting it to start. Once it started, it ran great, but it was so frustrating they finally gave up on it. There's this engine. There's another engine at the AACA Museum in Hershey, Pennsylvania, but it's a little bit different than this one with its hydraulic lines. A lot of them aren't original, so we were just so tickled to get that engine to tell the Tucker story. It's hard to walk by a Duesenberg and not talk about it. This is a gorgeous car, and it was one of the first to be donated to the museum, if I remember right. It's a 1925 Duesenberg, if I'm right. Yeah, and this one belonged to a fellow that was in the Chicago Mafia, if I remember right. And I don't know the full story on that, but when it was originally discovered, it had leopard print interior, and it was very, it was owned by somebody that was pretty, what's the word I'm looking for?
Notorious?
Kind of notorious and eccentric.
Yeah.
So it was restored back to its original colors, and we're just so tickled to have it because it really tells about Duesenberg, and not only as a car manufacturer that was extremely high end, but a company that was involved in racing as well, and they were very well known for their Indianapolis endeavors.
Yeah. So with it, in its early life, it could probably tell stories that would blister the pages of your magazine.
Yeah, that's right. As we get over to this corner, probably my favorite car in the museum is Ed Iskandarian's Roadster, which is on loan to us. It's a fabulous car for two reasons, because it's a survivor from the early days, kind of the golden era of hot rod building, when that was a new hobby. And this car has been untouched since it was built by Ed back before World War II. He actually built this car with his friend, and they were called Gow jobs back in the day. And he always refers to this car as his Gow job. And if you call it a Model T bucket, he'll get mad at you. It really is a hot rod. So we were tickled to have it here, because not only could we tell his story about being an early hot rodder, but a guy that started a company that everybody knows, Iskandarian Cams. And so, Ed's 100 years old. He's a great friend of the museum. We had him here for his 100-year-old birthday, and to hear him tell the stories of the glory days of hot rodding is really amazing. One of the reasons his car is here is because it has a set of these maxi overhead valve conversion cylinder heads. We thought there were only 2 sets in the whole world, and that so far has not been proven wrong. We had a set on a display engine, and of course Ed had a set on his old hot rod from before the war. So to bring these 2 sets of maxi heads together is really great. We have a few Corvettes on display. Great donor to the museum, just donated the 1953 Corvette to us. The gold car next to it is probably one of the most historic cars in the room. That is a 1957 factory GM race car, and it's one of the only GM race cars that is unrestored. It was recently discovered. It raced at Nassau, Bahamas, Daytona Beach, and at Sebring, and it actually won the Nassau Bahamas race. These are early NASCAR days, and that car was worked on by Zora Arkus Duntov, the man that's generally credited as the king of Corvettes, grandfather of Corvettes, the guy that took it from being a six-cylinder, kind of a tractor engine powered car to being a true American race car. So to have that car with all of its original prototype fuel injection parts on it, still has Zora's fingerprints all over it, is really great. It's painted gold because it was sold as a used car on a car lot right after GM was done using it. And a nice couple in Florida bought it, and they drove it around with the gold paint its whole life, never changed the engine until it was discovered by a man named Joe Tribalek, who I believe is like the Indiana Jones for vintage Corvettes. He discovered it, that it was still out there, and he was nice enough to let us use it and tell its story, so we're excited about that. As you look around the room, there's some other fabulous cars. We have the Al Bergler #1 Riddler winning car. So when people talk about winning the Riddler Award, this one won the first Riddler in 1964, and you might think, God, that's not a hot rod, but back then you could enter as a competition car, and he won it, and he didn't even really know what he'd won. He's like, oh cool, the Riddler Award. He put the trophy up in his attic and forgot about it for like 20 years. And later his friend was moving out of his house and said, hey, what do you want to do with all these trophies? And he said, oh, I think one of those is the Riddler, and that's a big deal now. So we have the Riddler trophy, #1 in the glass cabinet from Al, which is really cool. Another area of the museum that we are proud to talk about is the safety in racing, and just how much innovation there has been in that era or area of racing. Just in the other room when we walk by it is the safer barrier display that shows how the barriers at a lot of racetracks around the country, super speedways especially, were improved to help save drivers' lives when they hit the wall at high speeds. That was developed here in Lincoln, Nebraska, right at the University of Nebraska, right down the street from us, so we're really proud of that. We're also proud to have this display. We have some really cool stuff in here. We have the prototype for the Hans device on display. We also have Bill Simpson's fire suit where he set himself on fire at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Carson, do you remember what year that was?
I do not, but the picture in the corner shows the fire. So it wasn't just a little fire. He was fully inflamed, and part of it is at that time he was trying to get them to require safety suits that were fireproof.
As a matter of fact, Bill Simpson one day just surprised us all. He flew in. He had his own airplane toward the end of his life, so he flew into town and he brought all the people from the Indianapolis Motor Speedway Museum, and he sat right here in a chair with his little dog, and he did an interview with us talking about those days. And he said, people were giving me so much crap about whether or not I'd stand behind my fire suit and how much time you had on fire. He said, I'll show you. And right at the racetrack, doused them with gasoline and away it went. It's amazing nowadays the types of accidents racers can endure and walk away.
Yeah.
You look at this picture here in Hutchinson, Kansas, 1974, and it looks like a scene out of Hades. There's fire everywhere, smoke everywhere. But that was the scene you saw at a lot of local racetracks. I mean, I remember up in South Dakota watching video of my grandpa racing, and it seemed like every night ended that way. Cars upside down, and things have sure changed for the better. That's for sure, and we like to celebrate that. Well, we're here up on second floor, and as we traversed from first floor to second, I think you see a lot of the sub-collections that I think really make our museum different than most car museums. I think when you talk about car museums to most people, when I have to explain our museum, most people think of a car museum as a place where cars are just kind of parked door handle to door handle, and that's all you see. We really care about the human story behind the vehicles and the engines, but we also have a lot of sub-collections that talk about other things that are meaningful, not only to car culture, but to us here locally in Lincoln. I'm standing in front of a Cushman motor display, which was right down in Lincoln, Lincoln's downtown. around. So if you've ever owned a Cushman motor scooter, you know, that was built here in Lincoln. We also had a wonderful lunchbox display. We have a collection of movie posters, musical instruments, toy cars. I mean, the list goes on. And they're not just collections, they're some of the United States best collections of those things. So we're really proud to kind of have those things as kind of surprises around every corner when you come to the museum. And you know, a lot of times spouses get excited about those things too.
If we spin this way a little bit, you can see all the radiator ornaments, and this is an amazing collection of radiator ornaments. It's nowadays cars don't have radiators that stick through the hood, but back in the pre-war, the radiator ornaments were spectacular.
And it was a way to personalize your vehicle in an easy way, and so
That's
many
right.
people wanted to do that. So you'll see a lot of Egyptian symbols, because you know they had just discovered King Tut's tomb in the 20s, and of course people wanted to celebrate that and express themselves. This is about 50% of what we have at the museum. We have more than this that's not out on display right now, and when we expand, we're hoping to lay out some more cases, because I never get tired of looking at this stuff.
Tim, you know the story on this probably better than I do.
Yeah, this is kind of a cool display in my mind. You know, when you go to the Louvre, the art museum in Paris, everybody wants to see the Mona Lisa. This is probably one of our Mona Lisas, only because it's just such a crazy thing to have survived. This is a racing setup that really harkens back to the early days of racing in America, where you would travel to different tracks. 1920s, this thing stopped racing in 1933, and it made it as far, you know, it raced all over Nebraska. It made it as far as California into Colorado, and this is the way racing was done. You know, you had a very simple tow vehicle, and like you say, Carson, these two have been together since they were both conceived. And you know, when we acquired this, it was at an auction. And at the time, you know, there were some people bidding on it that were only interested in the race car. Of course, this was many, many years ago. You know, when old race cars, you know, were highly, highly sought after, and they were still coming out of the woodwork. But the people selling it said, no, we won't sell it to somebody that's going to only take the race car. And Bill raised his hand and said, I promise I'll keep them together. As a matter of fact, to keep them together and not have to separate them, even to bring them up onto the second floor of the museum, we developed a special lifting mechanism to get this thing all up in one piece, because it was too big for our freight elevator. And we cut a hole in the wall at the far end of the museum and drove it through so we could keep it intact. But it's called the Riverside Special. It's fabulous. It still has a Coca-Cola sign for a door panel on the inside, and there's all kinds of little surprises when you look at it. It's still oozing oil. It's kind of like the USS Arizona. it still drips oil. That's oil from 1933. It's very cool that it stayed together all this time. And you know, we're here in the Model T gallery, and what's really cool about this room, it's probably the largest assembly of Model T aftermarket parts anywhere in the country. And this was really what Bill Smith loved. And you know, sometimes people, as a curator, people come to me and they say, Tim, you know, we need more room in the museum. Maybe we should downsize the Model T room. And I say, no chance. I mean, this is a cool room because, you know, if you're like me, before I came to the museum, I thought the flathead Ford of the 50s was kind of the first high performance engine. And I realized that was absolutely not true. They were working on making cars faster almost the second the car arrived on the scene, and Bill became infatuated with these parts, and he started collecting these almost from the time he was a small boy, you know, squirreling away these, you know, cylinder heads that could be bolted onto a Model T to make the engine faster, and it was really great because, you know, Henry Ford really believed the Model T was perfect. Everyone else thought there was a way to improve it and they could make money doing that, and that's what this room really celebrates.
That's basically what made it possible for PRI to exist, is Henry Ford and his belief that his way was right, and everybody else wasn't sure about that. They thought they could maybe do it better.
And Bill was a big believer in that, you know,
yeah,
with being involved in the automotive aftermarket, you know, these were his heroes, you know. So,
that's right.
So that's really cool. This is a great car. So this is Edsel Ford's personal hot rod, and if you look at it closely, it's got a 6-cylinder engine back in a day when Henry believed 4 was enough for just about any car, and he was really against 6 cylinders until some other companies started giving him some competition, and he started working on them. But this car came from the Henry Ford Museum, and they had a new curator come on board, and he sold off this car and a bunch of the prototype engines. And just to show the foresight of Bill Smith, he was on it. He actually went to that auction and bought a lot of that stuff, including this fabulous car that we're so glad to have. And later the Henry Ford Museum would ask him if he'd sell them back, and of course we were happy to have them, so we didn't want to have them leave here. But I love this car because it really is Etzel's hot rod, and a car that he'd like to take around. Etzel was a neat guy because he also believed in style. Henry was kind of a pragmatic engineer, and he just wanted the car to work right. Etzel realized that all these other cars were coming up, the Chevys and the Dodges, and realized that he needed a car that also looked good, and he had to try to convince his dad, Dad, we got to up our ante a little bit and make cars that look nice. And so we can credit Etzel for the Model A Ford, the 32, the 33, all these beautiful cars that we love today as hot rods, were all created by Etzel. So to have his car is pretty cool. We love milestones. Of course, Henry Ford loved milestones, and anytime he hit a big number in his production, he liked to make a big deal about it. We actually have the 5 millionth Model T Ford in our collection. It's on loan right now to the Model T Museum. We also have this 10 millionth Model T, which is on loan to us from the family whose father restored this car. And in 1924, it made a trip from New York to San Francisco. And then in 1974, the man who restored this car made that trip again in this very car. So this car is put on a ton of miles, and it still looks great. As a matter of fact, this family's coming to visit us next weekend, so we're so excited to talk to them about it and learn more about the long-term plans for this car. But having these milestone cars is pretty fascinating. Not a lot of them still exist, and the ones that do are highly coveted, so
That's right.
We're glad to have this one too.
Wood spoke wheels.
Wood spoke wheels, and if they got a little loose, you just drive them through a creek and it would make the wood expand, and you'd tighten your wheel right up. It was great.
This is fun. You probably know the story about this more than I do, Tim.
Yeah, so this is the Benz motor wagon, and this comes to us all the way from 1885. So we like to credit this as being the first automobile. The original is long lost to time. Nobody knows where it is. Matter of fact, there may be portions of it in the Mercedes-Benz Museum, maybe, but they made just a very small number of these recreations. Nowadays, when these recreations change hands, you have to have your checkbook ready because they're not cheap. But we're just so happy we were able to acquire this one early and have it here to show as an example. But this was, really how Mercedes-Benz really got started. This was their first car, and to look at the technology in this car, it being an internal combustion engine,
one cylinder.
One cylinder. When it fires up, it'll shake the fillings out of your teeth. But it was a lot better than a horse. You didn't have to feed it. Yeah, it's a great piece, and there's a wonderful story about Bertha Benz and how she drove this car to really get the word out. When this car was created, it was kind of hush hush. Not a lot of people knew about it, but then she thought, we got to tell people about what we created, and she started traversing the countryside in one of these things, and it became really popular. They thought, boy, in those days, if she could do it, anybody could drive a car. So, it took a lot of the fear factor out of it.
Well, you definitely hear it coming from miles.
Yeah, it scared the horses in those days.
Yeah, that's right. This is one of my favorite displays. This display was actually put together by Jim Schumann, the museum's first curator, and it was in our old building on Van Dorn, and we took it apart and moved it here. But this basically is a Model T racer with all of the stuff that you'd have had in the garage, and I used to love to come and look at all of the tools and the parts that they had, just to understand what they had available to go racing with, and it's really fascinating. It's a display that a lot of times at lunch I'd get my lunch and I'd come and stare at it for 15 minutes and just think about the pieces that are here And it's a display that takes a while to fully comprehend.
The hand crank drill press, love that. You know, the
Little air compressor up in the top.
oh yeah, the leather license plate. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, imagine that. Yeah, back in those days, you had your piece of leather, and they'd sell you just the numbers, and then you'd have to hammer them into your piece of leather. Cool stuff.
And now this is the midget room.
This room is really fascinating because here we celebrate midget racing at its finest. And if you look across this room, you'll see a wide variety of cars, but really the engines are what are the craziest thing, just to show the variety of power plants that were used in midget racing over the years. You know, we have everything from the beginning of midget racing to the very latest. Here we have TRD, serial number 1, right, Carson? I
That's
mean,
right.
what's better than that? And that was donated to us here just recently to show, you know, what's being run at tracks today. Here we have Steve Lewis's midget, you know, the founder of PRI. You know how proud we are to have that on display along with all these other midgets. This room is full of just all kinds of engines, you know, rotary valves, Chevy technology, early fuel injections. I mean, this room is just a plethora of crazy pieces, parts, and speed equipment from over the years. We have a V16 Chevy down at the end. We also have a production ZR1 Corvette engine here from 1998, so and everything in between. One of my favorite rooms is this room. This is the Flathead Ford V8 room. On the wall, we have 368 flathead intakes that are all different. Back before they had the internet and everybody had a new idea how to make speed with a flathead. We have the biggest collection of overhead valve conversions for flathead engines. Now, a lot of people know the Arden cylinder head conversion, but we also have Alexander, you name it. If there was a cylinder head conversion, it's here on display. We definitely want to look in here before we look at those prototype engines.
This is a collection of pedal cars that we've got for the kids. And you can kind of see the extent of it. Well, we won't go much farther than this, but it's quite an extensive collection. There's a lot to look at right here.
These are all unrestored pedal cars and trikes and anything with wheels that kids could have enjoyed all the way back to the 1800s. We have the world's oldest pedal car, 1898 on display here. The Alamite Page, which is right next to me, 1924. This pedal car cost $280 when a Model T costs about the same amount of money. So imagine that kid at Christmas Day, you know, receiving a pedal car that was the same price as a Model T. We also have some bicycles on display, you know, things from the early days, balloon tire racers, the BMX, and muscle bikes, of course, with the Schwinn Stingrays. So a little bit of everything in here. For those of you guys that like crate engines out here, we've got you covered. This is a 1948 flathead crate engine in the crate.
Yeah, block.
which is great. Yeah, it is just a block, but it's brand spanking new.
I don't think Ford built a crate engine ever.
I don't think they did. We do have an all aluminum flathead, which is super duper rare. They actually made those for aircraft later, but to have an aluminum block flathead's a pretty rare deal too.
This is a collection that everybody gets excited about. Unfortunately, they've walked for 2 hours before they get here.
Yeah. But you know what's funny, Carson? When I ask people their takeaway when they're leaving the museum, I always ask, what are you going to remember about the museum? And so many times they say the lunch boxes. I'm like, what about the Tucker or the Miller race car?
Yeah.
You know, the Riverside Special.
And people will love to stand here and try to find their lunchbox on the wall.
Yeah. So, it's pop culture at its finest. Yeah, I mean, everybody's got some kind of relationship with something.
So this is the top floor of the museum, and there's quite a view available.
We're standing in an area right now that is a collection that Joyce Smith, Bill's wife, and Carson's mom created. And Joyce got kind of tired of carrying all Bill's stuff around, and one day she discovered a little makeup case that had a yellow taxi cab on the front. And she asked Bill, she said, wow, this is really neat. You know, they'd give these to you when you got in a cab to powder your face or whatever. And she said, I wonder how many taxi cab items there are out in the world. And we found out. She collected for many years, and you know, we're proud to show off her passion too. Up here you see a lot of restored pedal cars. Downstairs are all the unrestored cars, and up here we put a lot of the restored cars, and they're pretty fabulous. This is the Easy Spin Dizzy Foundation Gallery, and this is a gallery that pays tribute to miniature race cars. So everything in this room is nitro powered. So if any of your viewers out there race nitro RC cars, these are the grandfathers of that, back before they had radio technology. So these things had really intricate running gear, nitro-powered piston-driven engines, and they'd a lot of times run on the end of a cable. So you'd have a center post, you'd get these things fired up, and as they built up momentum, they'd have flywheels on their engines. They'd go faster and faster until they were just a blur, and they could actually calculate the speed of the car by how many laps it made in a certain period of time, and it was very competitive. And if you asked any of these guys what they were doing with their toys, they'd freak out. They considered these actual race cars, especially during the war years when there were fuel rations. This was the way they would actually race.
World War II is actually what made this become so popular, because you couldn't get gasoline and you couldn't get rubber. So what do you need for a race car? You need fuel and tires.
Absolutely, and you know, we're so lucky we have some items here that are not only the cars, which are uber rare to find these days and really expensive. If any of you out there have them, give me a call. I'm always interested in adding more to our collection, but we have some early molds, some of the prototypes that were built back in the early days by the Alexander brothers, the Dueling brothers, Barney Korn, you know, the list goes on, and we've tried to separate this gallery by manufacturer so you can really see what they were doing. You know, Barney Korn's a great example of a guy that made some wonderful pre-war cars, but he was also doing movie props for Hollywood. This was actually a prop in the movie To Please a Lady in 1949 that was actually used in the movie. So these guys were multi-talented and had a market for these cars. We think it's the first place nitromethane was used in an internal combustion engine. We actually have a little booklet over here that shows how they mixed the fuel pre-1940 with nitromethane in the mix, and what is thought to have happened is the drag racers caught on to this and realized, wow, these model guys are doing it, why can't we run our cars on nitro? And of course the rest is history. So this ties into what we're doing quite a bit.
Yeah, show the board track. There are basically two ways people race these. They raced them on the tether, so there was basically a pole with a cable and raced in a circle. And then they built board tracks. And the board tracks, this is a recreation of the board track that they run on. This was basically, you know, kind of the corner, and then the straightaways would flatten out and then they'd go in a corner. So it was similar to the board tracks that they raced on in the teens and 20s all over the country, only these were with the little cars rather than with the Model T racers.
These particular cars are cool. They belong to a man named Roy Richter who started Bell Auto Parts. And if you have a Bell helmet, that's your guy. He was racing tether cars when he was a young man and a not so young man. So, you know, people that were part of our industry that were also part of this craze, it makes an interesting tie into history. As we move into this next couple of rooms, you're gonna see a lot of tin toys. And I know Bill was really into tin toys, Carson, and this room is a kind of a celebration of that. Tin toys are fascinating to me because after World War II, when America was trying to get Japan back on its feet, Japan really got invested in the toy business. And they had a lot of things left over from the war effort, a lot of tuna cans and ration cans, and they'd cut those things apart and use them for the raw materials to make the earliest tin toys. And there are some of these race cars in this room that if you flip them over, you can still see the word tuna written on the inside. I mean, that's how rudimentary these things were when they were first built. And of course, Japan would go on to create a lot of fascinating toys. And this room is just tin toys and racing pedal cars. So all the pedal cars that are, you know, race cars are in this room. And it's just probably one of the best examples of a tin toy collection focusing just on race cars anywhere in the country. Carson, you had to have seen your dad and brothers kind of helping out with this collection over the years.
Yeah, I know that 98 car right there is probably one of the cars that they most value, because this got lost in the warehouse for 8 years, and when we were moving over across the street, we found it.
Oh boy, I didn't know that.
And they were quite excited that they'd found that 98 car. In the corner up there is a picture of, I'll go stand by it.
Oh yes, that's a great picture.
That's a picture of my grandfather, my dad, and myself. And I don't remember this because I wasn't very old, but I was in a pedal car, probably mostly like this, but this color. So.
This little red car over here, of course all this stuff has a story, but there's a little plastic red car down here that is amazing. A man comes to the museum and he said, I carried that car with me on 2 tours of Vietnam. It was my lucky charm. I always had it in my upper pocket. And he said, when I got back, I always wanted to do something special with that car, so I donated it to the museum. And to know that car has kind of been around the world and was somebody's lucky charm is pretty cool.
And been through 2 tours in Vietnam. That's a big deal.
Yeah. A lot of these cars are fascinating because as you're collecting these things, you know, prior to eBay, prior to the internet, you had to have an amazing memory, you know. So, you know, Clay Smith tells the story all the time of going out with his dad and they'd find a tin toy and they'd have to discuss whether or not they had it because the colors were flip-flopped, you know. And there are some examples you'll see in these cabinets where it's the exact same car, but the body's yellow and the exhaust is red, and then they flip it so the body's red and the exhaust is yellow. And here are a couple of examples like that.
This display right here is kind of an example of that.
Yeah, I mean, so many cars that look similar, but there were just slight variations. Of course, these cars are an example of that too. Exact same car, but just with different colors flip-flopped. So, you know, that's pretty neat. Then there are cars that, as they were working at the factory, you know, they'd build the race car and they'd have to put a driver in, and they might have a box of farmers' heads and a box of race car drivers' heads, and they'd put the farmer's head on the race car, and we have an example of that over here, which is pretty cool. And these toys were not tough toys. They were easy to destroy. So the fact that so many survived, you know, from the 40s and 50s to this day, you know, is pretty fascinating. And the colors bleed so fast, so you have to be really careful about the amount of light you give these things. So it's just a lot of fun. Well, it's been a lot of fun to have you join us on what is really just a tour, scratching the surface of the collection here. I know Carson and I could go on and on just about anything here at the museum. You'll definitely want to come and see us. You know, we were just voted USA Today's #1 attraction for automotive lovers in America, and then you can see why. I mean, it really is kind of like a Disneyland for gearheads, and there's a surprise around every corner. We're open Monday through Friday from noon to 4:30, and that's during the summer hours from May to October. And then when we hit our winter hours at the end of October, we're open on Monday and Friday and Saturday. So you'll want to be sure to check out our website, www.museumofamericanspeed.com. You can also find us on Facebook. Feel free to contact us anytime with questions that you have. Carson, I know visitors are always our top priority. We have tour guides that'll give you a tour and really make your visit special. What am I forgetting? I know we've missed so much.
We've talked about all of the volunteers that help us. You know, give a shout out to them one more time, the docents. And when you come for your tour, the docents will probably be the ones that you'll be dealing with, and they are absolutely passionate about the museum and telling the stories, and it's a really fun group. So.
Well, you know, it's something too that you can subscribe to our page on Facebook, but you can also subscribe to be part of our mailing list. And what that'll do is that'll get you on our mailer once a month to tell you all the events that happen here at the museum, including our Cars and Coffee events, Model T Speedster Reunion, Lego Pit Stop. I could go on and on. There's a lot of things here to get you involved. No matter what time of the year it is, you'll want to be sure to visit. I promise you won't regret it, that's for sure.